All right, welcome everyone to the March 2022 meeting of FMDiSC, FileMaker developers in Southern California and now all over the world. We are going to plunge right in. As you know, the mini meeting's being recorded. First up, we actually have a little change in the schedule from what was in the email. So we're going to actually flip the two presenters. So first up, we have Jason Wood talking about S3 as a FileMaker container alternative. And I want to especially thank Jason because at the last meeting, I put out a call for presenters for this meeting. And Jason emailed me right afterward and says, hey, I got something I can share with the group. So that's always appreciated. And who has the next meeting actually? Dave, is that you?
Yeah, that's me. That's me.
Yeah.
I'm next.
So you'll have an opportunity to put out a similar call if you need presenters for the next meeting. We'll do that during the announcement time. So without further ado, Jason, take it away.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for having me and thank you for coming to my presentation. I want to look at storing documents in FileMaker apps and how we can use S3 and similar services to gain a number of benefits over container fields. But first, we need to talk about container fields. They've been around since FileMaker was FileMaker. They're easy to implement and they're easy to use, but when used to store large files or large numbers of files, they impose a heavy burden on your FileMaker infrastructure. It can be like a ball and chain attached to your FileMaker database, making it more cumbersome to move data between systems or to manage backups. And the more files you add, the worse it gets. S3 stands for Simple Storage Service. It's an AWS product, and there are others that offer compatible services too. So what is S3? It's an example of object storage, and this is very different from block storage, where a certain amount of space is provisioned in advance and the device is mounted to a computer as a volume. In object storage, objects or files are organized into buckets and stored and retrieved using API calls. And you don't have to think about the underlying hardware. You can scale from megabytes to petabytes as quickly as you can upload the data. And in S3, you only pay for what you use. In object storage, objects have paths that can look a lot like directory structures, but they're not real directory structures. The path is really just an extended object name or key. When you upload an object to S3, it will be automatically replicated across at least 3 availability zones by the time the transaction completes. Availability zones are physically separate data centers that are between 1 and 100 kilometers apart. Amazon guarantees 11 nines durability. That's 99.99 and 7 more nines % durability per year. That means if you store 10 million objects in S3, you should expect to lose 1 file every 10,000 years on average. Caution, this doesn't protect you from accidental deletion. When you delete a file, it's deleted from all availability zones by the time the transaction completes, and there's no recovery. That is, unless you use a feature called versioning. And let's talk about that. There are many optional S3 features. We won't get into them all, but here's a few that can help you keep your data safe. When you turn on object versioning, anytime you attempt to overwrite or delete a file, the previous is retained as a version. You would have to explicitly delete the version using credentials that have permission to do that in order to actually delete the file. Object lock allows you to set a retention policy for files, preventing them from being deleted for a specific period of time or indefinitely. Block all public access is a simple checkbox that is selected by default, and it makes it impossible to make an object available publicly. So what does S3 cost? S3 standard is the default object class in S3, and it has the highest storage cost. It's 2.3 cents US per gigabyte per month in US East. There are other fees associated with S3 as well, such as fees for uploads and retrievals and fees for the bandwidth you consume when you download from S3. These are usually going to be less than your storage costs, but it depends on your usage. And depending on your usage patterns, you may be able to save on fees by using different storage classes. For example, S3 standard infrequent access cuts your storage cost by about half, but it doubles your retrieval cost. So it's recommended for objects that are accessed less frequently. And S3 one zone lowers your costs by storing your data in one zone only. So it doesn't have 11 lines durability. You should only use it if you have the ability to reconstruct your data if it's lost. S3 Glacier Deep Archive is for data that you access once or twice a year, and it takes up to 12 hours to restore, but it reduces your storage cost down to less than 1/10 of a cent per gigabyte per month. And that's just a few of them. Most of us probably won't need to think about object classes for a while though. If you're currently using containers to store data, you're probably storing no more than tens of gigabytes, maybe 100 gigabytes on the high end. That's going to be between pennies and about $3 a month with S3. So how do we get started? All of this information I'm about to show you is in my blog post, which is very detailed, so you don't need to write anything down, and we're going to go through this relatively quickly. This is the main screen for the S3 service in AWS. To create a bucket, you'd click that orange button right there, and then you'd provide a bucket name and select a region. As you scroll down, you'll see that block all public access is selected. Normally, you would leave this on unless you were doing a bucket that you wanted the entire contents to be public. With this object enabled, you ensure that no matter what you do with individual objects, you can't accidentally make anything in your bucket public. Only an AWS identity with privileges to read the bucket will be able to access your data. After you click Create Bucket, you should see your bucket in the list. The blog post includes an additional step to configure the cross-origin resource sharing options, which will be necessary if you plan to interact with your bucket through a web browser. And it will also walk you through the process of setting up API keys and a policy. Policy is similar to a privilege set in FileMaker. The presigned URL is a URL that can be used to make a specific call to the AWS API. It includes a signature that is generated from a set of API credentials, and it allows the holder of the URL to execute that specific call for a specified period of time without granting any other access. So this is an example of a presigned URL. So let's have a look at what's here. This is the bucket name, which forms part of the complete host name. This is the object key, which includes the file name and optionally some additional structure to organize the file in the bucket. You can see here that I'm using a UUID. And this is the date when the presigned URL becomes valid. Usually this is when you create it. And this is the number of seconds that it's valid for. In this case, 1 hour, but it can be anywhere from 1 second to 7 days. And lastly, this is the signature. It incorporates everything you see plus the method, such as get, put, head, or delete. And if you change any of those details, the signature will no longer be valid and the request will fail. So this is a FileMaker custom function that I created to produce presigned URLs in FileMaker. This function is available on GitHub, and the link is in the blog post. I'll put it in the chat as well. There's 8 parameters. The method, so this would be get, put, head, or delete, depending on what your operation is. The AWS bucket name, the AWS region, the file path is the object key. In expire seconds, the number of seconds you want the URL to be valid for, starting from the moment of creation. And then you would supply the AWS API credentials in the next 2 parameters. And the last parameter, options object, normally can be left blank. It's a JSON object that allows me to add features to the function in the future. Right now it has one capability, and that is to pass a host name in case you're using an S3 compatible service that's not AWS. So here's an example of how you would upload a file from a container to S3 using the presigned URL. So in line 2, we set the object key or the path. In line 3, we create the presigned URL using the put method. In line 4, we assign the container to a variable. In line 5, we set the content type or the MIME type. This is important if you wish to render the file in a browser, including a web viewer, as it will be sent back as a header that the browser requires to display it. Without this information, the browser would simply download the file. There are custom functions available for FileMaker to determine the MIME type from the file extension. And lastly, in line 6, it's the curl string where we prepare the content type header and reference the container variable as a binary file. We make the call in line 7, and if the file upload completes, S3 will send back a 200 response code. So here's an example where we want to retrieve the file from S3 and insert it into a container. So this time we use the get method. We don't need to supply the content type. We're expecting a binary file and we're targeting a variable. So we use the special --fm return container variable curl option. And if the response code is 200 OK, we should have the file in a variable. We can then set it to a container field. To delete a file, we use the delete method. And in this case, we expect to get a 204 response code, which means the file was deleted or it never existed to begin with. And here's an example of how you might display a file in a web viewer. This example assumes the file is an image file. There's some HTML there and CSS to format it. If you store different types of files, you'll need to build in some logic to use a different HTML template for different file types. For a PDF, you don't need any HTML, just pass the URL alone and it will render. An image would do that too, but it won't resize to fit the layout, which this will do. You could reference this calculation directly in a web viewer, but you'll find that it refreshes continuously if you resize the window or when you give or take away focus from the web viewer. So I recommend to always leave the web viewer calculation empty and instead use a script trigger to set the web viewer when the layout loads or when the web viewer becomes visible, such as when changing tabs or opening a popover. And the reason for that is because the custom function that's referenced here incorporates the current timestamp. So that is all changing. Now, the web viewer allows us to view the file and it allows us to download the file, but you may have noticed that I promised a container alternative, and yet we're still uploading files from containers. So now I want to show you how we can use an open source JavaScript library to take it to the next level, completely remove containers, and build an amazing user experience that's at least as good as anything that we can do now with containers. And if you want to bookmark this blog post, I'll give you a few more seconds to scan the code. I'm about to show you a demo file, and you can download it there if you'd like your own. And I just need to change my sharing. Okay. So here is the blog post, and I'll chat that now. And you're seeing the right screen, right? Do you see my web browser?
Yes, we see defined space.
Okay, I thought there was supposed to be a green box around it, but that's cool. So this is very detailed. As I said, it has all of the step-by-step instructions to set up S3. So I'm not planning to go into that in too much detail, but feel free to ask your questions. So here is the sample file that you can download. And let's just get right into a demo. So this is an example of, imagine this is a project management solution. So this is a record, we call it My First Project. And I'll just take a bunch of files, I'll click Upload Files, and I'm going to drag some images here and click Upload. And it's done. So this is a JavaScript library called Uppy. And what happened here is when I clicked Upload, Uppy ran a FileMaker script for each item to tell FileMaker the file name and the file size. And then FileMaker sent back a presigned URL. And then Uppy sends the file directly to S3. So none of the data actually went through FileMaker or the FileMaker server. And this also works in WebDirect and FileMaker Go, any platform. So and even in WebDirect, the files are literally going straight from the browser to S3. So they're not involving FileMaker server at all. So now I can click on any of these files to navigate them. I have an icon here that allows me to get a presigned URL. So if I wanted to share this image with somebody, I could, let's say I wanted them to have 7 days to download it. I can click the URL, and now anyone can open that in a web browser. I can delete files, of course, and I can resize. Here, let's get one that's horizontal. Resize the window, and it will resize the image to fit in the space that I have. Let's try some other file types. Another file. This is a movie. So you can see this is actually cut off here because I just haven't gone to the effort of setting up an HTML template for video yet. It's just, I believe it's just embedding that file directly in the web browser without any CSS or anything. If we do a, here's a, we should do a PDF. Here, I'll do a, there we go, PDF, and I'll do a Word file as well. So if I click on the, oops, where's the PDF? Oh, there it is. So that just loads directly in the web viewer. This is really exactly the same as an interactive container is a web viewer. So this is basically identical to that thing. And of course, we can't preview a Microsoft Word document. So any file type that I haven't said that we can preview, it's just going to pull up this sort of generic page. I have this silly random image happening in the background as well each time it loads. And you can click on download to get this file in your downloads folder on your computer. So this is one example of how you could implement this. I've also built an example using Popover. So this would be if you have less space and you're using this side of the screen for something else. This renders the images in a Popover. It's exactly the same PDF, Word file, and it has that presigned URL link in the bottom of the screen here. You may have noticed something interesting here, and that is that web viewers aren't supposed to work in portals. They normally take on the values from the first record. But what I've done here is I have a script trigger that runs when the Popover opens that sets the web viewer. Of course, the script trigger knows what row it's on. So it sets the presigned URL or it sets the HTML to the web viewer at that moment. So that's why that works. It's a pretty cool way around that problem. And then lastly, I did an example of just a single attachment, more like a typical container field, one attachment per record. Here, I'll just make a new record. So it has drag here to upload. And then okay, there's a little glitch there, but anyway, so now it's showing me that image, and I can't upload another one unless I delete it first. So that's the sample file, and I think now I'll give you a little bit of a look at the S3 console. So here's the main page of the S3 console. Here's my bucket that I'm using. So if I click here, that's interesting that it says no objects. I'll try refreshing that. Okay, now there's 11. So these are the ones I just uploaded. You can see it, they're all just UUIDs, and if I click inside, I can see that I have the file with the original file name. So the reason I chose to use a UUID is because I didn't really want to change file names, and I don't want to worry about conflicts when I have two files uploaded with the same file name. So yeah, I just figured that was the simplest way to go. I've also considered using a more meaningful structure. You could put in, say, the module, whether it's projects or something else, and then you could put project number, for example, something like that. But this allows me pretty much unlimited flexibility. I don't intend to browse the files through the console, just through FileMaker. So that's how I've decided to build it, but you could very easily change the structure of those paths if you wanted to. Let's have a look at some of the information we get here. So here's the type, JPEG. That's because we passed up the MIME type or the content type. If we didn't do that, it would just say a binary stream or something like that. There's a URL here to the object, but it's probably not going to work. No, it's not going to work because access denied. This is not a public bucket. If it were, it would work, but it's a private bucket, so you need the presigned URL, or you need to request it some other way through the API. Okay. By the way, here's the presigned URL. Put that in the link too. And maybe I'll have a look at the chat right now to see if there's any questions coming in. And feel free to jump in with your questions.
I actually have a question. We had a customer who was a real estate agency, and they have 20, 30 images per property that they're listing and stuff like that. So they had thousands and thousands of images. And so they needed to bulk upload, tens of thousands of images at a go. And sometimes it would either conk out, or they'd screw something up, or accidentally push the low res instead of the high res. And so they would have thousands of images up there that they wanted to smoke. And, when they re-uploaded, they would sort of lose the handle they had to grab onto to get to that image. And so you'd have to sort of interpolate, is this indicating it's a V2 image or something like that, therefore indicating the presence of a V1, and we need to back into a URL for a V1, so we have a URL to say, hey, delete that thing. But they were talking, and the storage isn't super expensive, but over time the accumulated cruft of waste images made it worthwhile to try and do some bulk deletes, and it was problematic to get at those when they had been iterated a couple times.
Okay, so it depends a little bit on how you're doing your versioning. If you're using the AWS feature versioning, then and you're uploading to the same path, obviously, in that case, then the file sort of gets bumped back into a version, and it's not available through the same methods in the API. You actually need to request the version that you want. Something that you could do is you could set up, let's see, looking for lifecycle rules, management. Yeah, lifecycle rules. So I could set up a lifecycle rule that says move non-current versions of the expire, delete. Yeah, here we go. Permanently delete non-current versions of objects. So then we could say after 90 days, delete anything beyond the most recent version of the object automatically. So as you see, there's lots of different things you could do here.
Yeah, that's nice.
You can use similar rules to move between classes too, like I was mentioning about lower cost storage classes. So if it's a project management system, maybe this, and actually this would apply to real estate too, right? Because this is it's like a project. It has a start and an end. Hopefully the end is fairly soon after the start. And then those images aren't going to be requested too frequently. So you could say after a certain number of days, you move it between storage classes. So you transition to deep archive or something like that, a certain number of days after creation. So there's lots of ways to handle that.
So if you wanted to like take the old stuff, maybe you got a listing 3 years ago and it's long sold or whatever, and you want to push it to Glacier, how would you?
Well, if you're doing it with a lifecycle rule, you could say apply to all objects in the bucket, move current versions of objects between storage classes. Maybe if you're using versioning, maybe you want to do non-current as well. And then you could say 180 days, go to Glacier Deep Archive, which is the lowest cost of the storage classes.
Cool.
You can also.
These tools look better than I remember.
This looks better. Yeah, it has improved a lot in the last few years. You could do, if we're doing standard name frequent access first, say after 60 days, we could add another transition to deep archive after, say, 180 days, something like that. Oh, and then you set it. You also have to set the rules again for the non-current versions. Again, only if you're doing versioning.
So since Chris is asking these questions, I'll just jump in a little off topic, but this versioning also helps with security. So let's say your images get hacked or encrypted, not by the people who actually own it, then this versioning, the older versions, I believe, can't get touched. So as long as you're not actually deleting them, you're just storing them, you can still access the unencrypted versions.
Yeah, so you can delete versions, but anything that you do with the S3 API, you're doing through an API key that's attached to a policy. So the policy that is configured for this FileMaker app, for example, doesn't have permission to delete versions. So if you delete a file using this API key, the only option is for that file to become a version. And then the current version is actually just a marker that basically says deleted in that case. So it can be a bit confusing when we're talking about deleting files. It just becomes version 2, and version 1 just is empty.
Have you looked into when you move a file to a different type of storage, have you looked into updating FileMaker, letting FileMaker know that it's in a new place?
I haven't done moving between object classes yet. I haven't had the need to, because my S3 bill is still only about $1 a month. So yeah, that might be useful information to know. Actually, I can't remember if the head request would provide that information to FileMaker. It would be useful because you could use it to prevent the preview from automatically coming up and running up your bill, I guess.
Thank you.
Is that what your rationale was?
I always, it's sort of like, well, that's a great change in your ability to do that. And my thought was, well, who's going to tell FileMaker? So it's just.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. There's probably a few ways to do it, but you can also, FileMaker can also do the moving of the objects. You don't have to use a lifecycle policy. You can use an API call to move the object.
Well, thank you. That's great.
But that reminds me of a limitation that I want to resolve actually with this S3 presigned URL function. Is it doesn't do that. You can use it to run a head request, which will pull back content type and file size and things like that. But I don't think it tells you the object class. And there's no way to move the object into a different object class with this function, but I think I want to implement through the options object to be able to pass additional AWS headers, which would then allow you to do that.
I think another reason, sorry, I think another reason that it might be helpful for FileMaker to know is that I think that deep storage class has a possibility of a 12-hour retrieval time, right? So you might be spinning or at least wondering why the image isn't coming up if it takes that long.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and it's yeah. I actually haven't used Glacier Deep Archive, so I'm not sure exactly. I believe that you have to make a specific call to restore the object, basically. And then you can, I guess you can get a webhook to notify you when it's ready.
Jason, a couple other questions in the chat. One is, can this work / display TIFF files also?
Yeah, if the browser can display a TIFF file, I think it, I don't think I have any TIFF files handy, but let's just have a quick look at, I think it's in here. So, is image. So yeah, basically I'm looking for these extensions to decide if I'm going to try to push the image to the browser through an image tag. And I don't see TIFF here. I don't remember how I arrived at this set. So I'm not sure if a TIFF works in an image tag. If it does, you could just add it here. Otherwise, it's going to just attempt to, actually, no, it's just going to give you the file download page that I showed earlier. But you can see how I handle PDF. If is PDF or is movie, we just output the URL. So you could add is TIFF to there if the browser can display it. Actually, if the browser can display it, you would just add it up here and it would use the image tag.
Great. Another question, and you may have covered this. So Steve,
yeah, no problem.
Let me know if you already covered, but can you talk about the storage classes? What's the technology difference between some of the types? How fast to retrieve some of the different types? So I think you touched on that. But... Yeah,
I touched on it. Let's see. So here they are. Actually, no, we'll see if these descriptions are enough here. So there's standard, which isn't listed here because it's the default. And then there's standard infrequent access. So this is just as fast as standard. It has the same redundancy. You cut your storage cost in half roughly, and your retrieval cost doubles roughly. So the typical recommendation is once a month for this one. And then you've got, let's skip intelligent tiering and skip to one zone is for data that you can rebuild. So I mentioned earlier, this is the one that's not redundant across availability zones. So it's on one hardware device in one data center. I can't remember roughly where the cost is on that, but it's even lower than infrequent access. And then Glacier Instant Retrieval gives you, again, lower storage cost, higher retrieval cost, basically. And they say 90 days minimum storage duration, so you can't move it in and then move it out 2 days later because you want to download the file with standard. You're stuck paying for 90 days of this class. And then flexible retrieval. So this is when you get the delay starting, minutes to hours. And then Glacier Deep Archive is when you get into hours. We can have a quick look here at S3 pricing. That's not what I wanted. There you go. Okay, so storage, so you can see 2.3 cents, as I mentioned, and then, oops, sorry, and then we've got infrequent access, cuts it in half, and then one zone, even lower still. Instant retrieval, now we're at less than half a cent. And now we're less than 1/3 of a cent until we get to less than a 100th of a cent or 1,000, whatever. a very small amount of money. And then we can go over to requests and data retrievals. So these are, let's see, so downloading a file, that's a GET request. So with S3 standard, it's a 25th of a cent for every 1,000 requests. So pretty tiny. And then it says data retrievals per gigabyte. That's it's not entirely true that it's NA, because any data coming out of Amazon costs, I think it's 9 cents per gigabyte. So going up is free, but coming down is 9 cents per gigabyte. So yeah, there's a lot of detail here. I think you'll find that the storage cost is the largest for most uses, which is a clue that you could probably change your class as well. Oh, maybe I should briefly mention the intelligent tiering. So this is designed to make it easier on you. Amazon, if you don't have consistent access patterns throughout your bucket, you can basically hire Amazon to figure it out for you, basically. So you're paying a commission, which is a tiny percent of a cent per 1,000 objects, for Amazon to just take over the responsibility of deciding how to move objects between classes. And so they'll just keep moving objects around based on how you use the bucket. And so if you have very small objects, this can be pricey because it's price per object, but otherwise that could be a good option that's worth considering. But the main thing to remember is if you're new to S3, it's probably going to be a long time before you have terabytes of data where your bill is getting into the tens of dollars per month, right? So you don't need to think about this too much to get started. Don't let this intimidate you.
There's a follow-up question or a follow-on question really from Michael Frankel. So when moving objects between storage classes, does the bucket name and other information change, or is that all handled behind the scenes?
Yeah, it's all at the object level. So the storage class is at the object level. So everything's the same.
Okay, so no need to change bucket or anything like that, especially obviously if Amazon's doing it for you with that intelligent tiering, then I assume it would be completely transparent.
Yeah, you won't even notice, and it's not gonna put it in deep archive 12-hour delay. It's only gonna move it between infrequent access and the next one there.
Okay. So we have another question about 60 gigabytes and mostly PDFs. Add about 2 gigabytes a month. Only the past 2 months are probably the only ones that are actively viewed. So he's basically trying to get a sense of, what this might cost. And I assume there's some calculators
Yeah.
that you could put in, the various parameters in terms of how much you want to download and all that kind of stuff, and help figure those out. But it sounds like from what you're saying, it's a little bit academic because
Yes.
unless you're dealing with, if you're saying terabytes of data, the actual dollar figures are going to be so low that it's not that relevant.
Yes, so we're talking about 60 gigabytes here. So that's only $1.38 in storage, even in the most expensive storage class, which is S3 standard. So, and then, I would say that your other fees are probably going to be in the range of 50, 60 cents or something like that. So you're going to be less than $2, I would think, for this.
So it's basically not worth the developer's time trying to figure out how to optimize this, because it's
Not really. No, not until you're much, much more than that. And yeah, so that's another thing I should mention. You mentioned FM Better Forms, and so you can integrate this directly with FM Better Forms, and I'll show you how I've done that. So this is a client portal that I created with FM Better Forms. So this allows my clients to create tickets and schedule meetings with me, and do a whole bunch of other things. And so I also have a file upload feature here. So especially if I have a new client and I need them to send me their 10 gigabytes of FileMaker files, they can just drag it on here, and that uploads to S3, and then it's available in my management system. That's the same thing for creating a ticket. You can click upload attachments here, and there's your UPI uploader. You can also do if you're on Chrome, you can do a screen recording as well directly from here, or use the camera.
That's very nice.
And so the other thing to consider is if you wanted to use S3 for your pictures for your shopping cart or something like this for a public website, that would be where you don't use that block public access feature. You would make your entire bucket public, and then you don't need to worry about presigned URLs. So you can just store the permanent URLs in the product table.
Another question from Michael. So since some of the infrequent access storage classes have time constraints, is it possible to query an object to get its current storage class? I think you mentioned that before.
Yeah, I mentioned that it's definitely possible, but it's not possible with my presigned function at the moment.
Right.
So you'd have to build up an API call with AWS that has that capability.
Great. Will this work if FileMaker is hosted on Claris Cloud?
Yes.
Great.
Would it work for logos, images for HTML signatures, and emails? So that would be a case where you'd want to use a public bucket, because otherwise you'd have to reference the presigned URL in the email, and that would only be valid for a maximum of 7 days. So that's a great use case for a public bucket. Now, of course, you can have a bucket that has public and private objects in the same bucket. You can set the permissions on an object by object basis. I recommend not doing that just because it can get confusing, and obviously it's more of a security risk because you could accidentally make an object public. It's better to have a public bucket and a private bucket so that you can be much more certain about the status of an object.
Makes sense. Question from Paul. Are there any disadvantages compared to FileMaker containers? Obviously, you need internet access. So if you had it on your laptop and you were not connected, to the internet, you couldn't access any of these containers.
Yeah. So I have not tried using it in a list view. If you wanted to show like a thumbnail in a list view, so that would involve putting a web viewer in every row. And I'm not 100% sure on what FileMaker's drawing characteristics are for. I mean, does it start drawing a web viewer that's just below the screen? I'm actually not certain how it does that. One thing that you'd have to figure out is it probably, remember I mentioned an issue where if you put the presigned URL custom function directly into the web viewer calculation, it's going to keep refreshing whenever you give attention to the web viewer, or give focus to it, or take it away, or resize the window, because everything keeps changing because there's a timestamp involved there. You can't do that with a list view because every web viewer on in the bound set is going to have a different URL. So you probably would have to directly code the presigned URL into the web viewer rather than setting it with a script. So I was thinking about a change I could do with the custom function, perhaps through the options object, to specify a static start time so that it wouldn't use the current timestamp. You would actually pass in the start time that you want, and then it would allow that that result to be static until you ran a script that caused it to change again. So it means you have to set a longer period of validity, of course, so that as you scroll, it's going to keep requesting more and more images using that same start time. But that could be a way around it. So then the real question is how much overhead is involved in loading a web viewer 1,000 times if you're scrolling constantly. I'm not sure. I haven't tried.
Yeah, I could definitely see there being performance issues if you're scrolling through, hundreds of records.
It should be pretty similar to using an interactive container field, though, in a list view. There shouldn't really be any difference there. I don't think.
Hey, Jason, this is Steve Slater. I'm trying to think of like what an ideal use case for this would be. By the way, this is excellent presentation and really cool stuff.
Thanks.
Yeah, I have a client, for example, that they're in the art business. They create art. And so they have artwork, they have thumbnails. They have about 18 terabytes of data at the moment, which according to the calculator on intelligent tiering would be about $420 a month. But they are doing everything with images. They're mocking up things and they're showing 5 up, 10 up, they're printing stuff, they're doing all kinds of stuff. And every time, I would imagine, every time they kind of go to a different layout, it's going to call that image down from AWS, right? And they're even using like the Scribe plugin to put the image on a spreadsheet and things like that to export. So that doesn't actually sound like a great solution, because if only because you have to code all this stuff up, but you're doing a lot of up and down, or a lot of down. So sort of what would be a good use case type of company? Obviously, the storage can be really cheap if you don't have that many terabytes of data, but then you could easily store it, on-prem or in your cloud server or whatever.
Yeah. So first of all, did you say 18 terabytes?
Yeah.
So that's 18,000 gigabytes. So even in the most expensive, yeah, so that's the most expensive, that's standard. So I think for infrequent access, that would be about 210. Still quite a lot. I wanted to...
I guess, Jason, just to interject, I mean, compared to, what are they storing that on currently? I assume it's some sort of RAID and backups, and they're having to manage that, and offsite backups. And,
Yes.
there's a lot of exposure you take on, especially with those quantities of data, by managing it yourself. So it's not like it's free to just have it, on their server. And there's, so they're $400 a month sounds like a lot compared to,
Yeah, it's not even the cost. It's just everywhere. It's such an image-centric system. And
Right.
if you've got to sort of, for every layout, grab that image again, forgetting even well, I don't even know about the download, but coding it all up, right? Because every time you sort of need to code it up for every single layout, or am I thinking about it incorrectly?
No, not really. I mean, you can have this is a fairly simple demo file.
I guess you're right. I mean, I guess if the code is sort of in the web viewer and it's flexible, then you can do it. But you are downloading it every single time that image is being displayed in a different layout or printed or.
Yeah, it's true. So for example, when I click here and then here and then here again, it's downloading that image again. And there's actually a way around that, though, that I've considered doing something about. The only reason really that it downloads it again is because it's a new presigned URL based on the current timestamp, which changes every second. If I had a method to cache the previously generated presigned URL and use it again if it's still valid, then that would allow the browser to use its cache in order to show that object again. So that could reduce some of that load. The other thing to think about is, well, one thing I want to point out is that whether you're using S3 or FileMaker containers or whatever, you're still downloading files from somewhere. So I don't know exactly how much caching FileMaker does on big files and containers, but I would imagine, especially if you do something like I just suggested, I would think it would be similar. Another thing to think about doing is implementing something with thumbnails with S3. I haven't done this yet, but let's see, properties, event notifications. So you can attach a Lambda function to S3 so that whenever a file is uploaded to the bucket, S3 generates a thumbnail automatically, and you could store it alongside the main file. And then you could set up some logic so that depending on the file size, it gets the thumbnail in certain circumstances, whatever you decide.
Can I jump in on that? Hi, Jason.
Yeah, hi.
So I had, because I had to deal with a similar thing. Was it Steve asking? Anyway, and the way Jason's done it's really nice, and I've seen this before, and I'm going to be using quite a bit of it. But one can do a hybrid version. So like in your case, what I'm guessing is, and I've had this with photographers, they have these huge files that are really high quality that they rarely actually need because they need them when they're printing and stuff. But and they might need them if they're doing actual work on them in Photoshop, of course. But just like on FileMaker layouts, just viewing them, showing them, you never really need anything than 1080 by 1080p, right? So that can be that's much smaller than a big file, and that's pretty big, and you can make your thumbnails even a bit smaller than that, depending on what your screen size you're thinking about. So what I'm suggesting is maybe an interesting thing is, you could have a hybrid version where you do have a container field just storing thumbnails in FileMaker for convenience, but you take advantage of the S3 storage to store the real files and download them when you need them, kind of thing. Is that useful?
Yeah, you could absolutely do that, and FileMaker has the function to create a thumbnail from a container.
Yeah.
I think I would do it in S3.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah.
I just suggested, Jay. That's just a thought, Yeah.
Yeah.
But it was specifically to avoid that. If you're worried about all the downloading, uploading, that way it's then probably cached, or other ways. But cache a thumbnail on your local drive is kind of what I'm saying. Find a way to do that.
Yeah,
we've done some hybrid instances of that nature where somebody can drag something, keep a low res thumbnail, push the big one up to the cloud, and then pull those down for high res work or something of that nature. It does get past some of those short term. Obviously, you're hitting the FileMaker engine and the storage and all the things that come along with that, but you are circumventing some of the challenges of previewing and things that you can do that natively that a web viewer kind of struggles with sometimes. Some of the things we have to work around, but this is a really great example here, Jason.
One thing also, Jason, you mentioned, I think S3 compatible storage. So if people aren't familiar, there are a bunch of other services out there like Backblaze, who do the computer backups, also have one called B2 that is basically uses or API compatible with at least some of Amazon's APIs, but often at considerably lower cost. So I think you mentioned that that's something you use the options for, as if you're using a compatible S3 compatible service, that you can specify it there.
Yeah. So I'll just go into the data viewer here. And S3 presigned URL. Let's see. Oops. What was that supposed to be? Okay. You know what? It doesn't really even matter what I put in any of these things. That's the options object. So that's empty. So there's my presigned URL, and it's structured the Amazon URL. But if I put in whatever, oh, sorry, no, it's actually, it's host. Just say it's wasabi.com. I don't know what it is. So now it's just going to do region dot domain. So that should work, I think, with most of the third-party options. One of which is Wasabi here, and this I think this is one of the price winners. So the disadvantage is that you can't procure less than a terabyte per month, so it starts at $5.99, which is probably more than most of you will pay for S3. But if you have 18 terabytes, this can be a fair bit less than S3, so it's 108. I haven't looked into all of the differences, for example, the redundancy, the durability. I don't believe they have object classes, so this is just the straight price across the board. But yeah, might be worth looking at other options.
Hi, this is Dave. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So I was just thinking maybe for Steve, something like if you needed to manipulate some real files, that you could somehow maybe use insert from URL and grab the actual files, stick them in temporary containers and do your printing and then dump them.
Yeah, you can do that. Yeah, the Wasabi thing's pretty interesting. I wonder what that's even based on. That's crazy. It's pretty cheap.
Yep.
All right. Let's see. I see one last question. If you have a dev and production server and then you perform migrations, you recommend to switch in the buckets when on dev so as not to compromise objects in production?
Yeah, depends on exactly what you're doing in your dev environment. But yeah, that would probably be the best way. What I would do probably is in my preferences, I would have a prod and a dev version of the bucket, and then the system would choose it based on the current host name, just to be absolutely sure. But however you normally do those sorts of things would work. It can be tricky, right? Because sometimes you want to bring production data into a dev copy to be able to work with it, and then you don't have access to portions if you do that. So you'll just have to figure it out based on what your needs are, I think. But yes, it would definitely be a very bad thing if you have two FileMaker databases contributing objects to the same bucket. I mean, not a super bad thing. The problem is you could end up with orphaned objects that you could pay for years or forever. You know, could end up costing you 2 cents a year if the file is big enough. So you want to be careful about that. You can, of course, list your object contents, and you could have a looping script that makes sure there's still a pointer in your database, and then delete it if it's an orphan, or do something else with it. Maybe create a record to review it. Something to be careful about. Okay, thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. That was excellent presentation, and we really appreciate your stepping up and sharing with the group. Great, Paul, take it away.
Okay. So I don't do presentations very often, so forgive me if it's a bit rusty. So there's not, as far as I can see, there's not a huge amount to browser navigation. It's not a hugely complex thing. So I thought I'd just give a little bit of background as to where it came from. Originally, I was using this, I started using 2005, this AB navigation system, which was something that Scott Love put out, and it used a predefined XML navigation structure that you had to build in advance in order to use it. And that had a backwards and forwards navigation, which worked. But I have to admit, I got fed up of having to predefine my navigation. I'm not as organized as that, and it didn't kind of fit with the way I like to work. So I kind of put that aside and started using something else. And then later on, I had a request from a client that I'd inherited from somebody else for browser navigation. So I thought I'd take a look at it. And then I was really keen that it was quite lightweight and it would be really easy to add to an existing solution. So basically, the first version was one custom function, one script, and 2 buttons. Okay, and you put the 2 buttons on whichever layout you want to be included in the history. So how does it work? Well, I think it's probably easier to show you. So where's my file? Okay, that was weird because as soon as I went into presenter mode, I lost everything to do with Zoom, so I couldn't really see anything about Zoom, which was a bit strange. So here we go. Let's have a look. So here it is. So this was the initial file that I made, and it basically uses a list of layouts that you've been to. And as you navigate through, it adds them to the list, and as you go back, it shuffles them from the back list to the forward list. This is a couple of global variables which I'm just displaying on the layout. So if you just bear with me a sec, I've lost something. So there's the option to go to exclude things from the navigation just by not having the buttons on the layout, or you can just turn it on and off with a parameter, and then I can jump around and it doesn't really change. And I can put it back on again, and then as I move around, it will change again. So let's just reset it, and we're back again. So how does it work? Well, let's just have a look at, there's a custom function, which in this initial version is not doing very much. In fact, the bottom half of it is putting the tooltips on. The top half is what does anything. And there's not really much to say except for the fact that it looks at this list of, let's get back to BrowserNav. It looks at the list of layout numbers and layout names, and it moves them from one list to the other. There's not a huge amount going on apart from that. And then how it's triggered is it is just on the conditional formatting.
Quick question, Paul. It doesn't
Yeah.
rely on the layouts being numbered or named a certain
No,
way.
no, not at all.
Okay.
And this version initially is just uses the layout numbers, and it uses the names for description. So I'll show you that in a minute. But so basically, we have this custom function, which is when the layout is loaded, it says, oh, don't say, come back. It says, is the layout I'm on, is the layout number I'm on at the top of the list already? If not, don't add it. If it isn't, stick it at the top of the list. Okay, and that was really the key to making this work nicely, was to have the layout that I'm on as being the first item in the backlist, so that you could then very easily avoid having duplicate entries if you happen to refresh the layout or reload it. So I just lost my thought. So then the second part of it is just the script, which is just, that is all there is to it. So it takes in a script parameter, which is backward or forwards, and then it works out what the next layout is in either backwards from the backwards or forwards list. So if the action's forward, then get the one at the top of the forward list. If it's backward, get the second item from the backwards list, because the first item is the layout that I'm on at the moment. And then we're updating the lists, removed, and then we're going to the layout. That's really all there is to it. So that was the first version that I did. And then I had, when I first built this, my primarily working environment was Windows, and this was before 16. So therefore, us people working on the Windows platform, we had this lovely situation where we had an application window that all our database windows were constrained within. And so I would always run my database windows maximized, so there was no risk of my my brightest users losing their database under the side of the application window, which can happen. And so I hadn't really considered multiple windows. So when I put this up on Modular FileMaker in 2013, I think it was, I had quite a few people ask me about multiple windows, and so then that was the kind of the evolution of what came next, which was to add multiple window support, and then to allow you to have to turn off whether you wanted a single history for the windows, or whether you wanted an individual history for each window. And then it kind of stayed like that for a number of years. And then 16 came along and JSON started to be a thing. So I kind of decided that I wanted to redo it with JSON. And that's probably the next thing to show you. So this was the version with JSON, and basically instead of having a simple list, then we've now got a JSON object which contains the backwards and forwards stuff. So if I go back, then you can see here that there's a forwards and here's a backwards. And then I switched. I decided that layout numbers were fine for navigation because it was only happening within a single session, and the chances of the layout numbers changing whilst people were actually using it was fairly low. And then somebody came to me and said they would like to save somebody's history for a user and then reload it again so that they still had the history the next time they logged in. And at that point I thought, well, let's switch to using layout IDs rather than layout numbers. Seems to me it's a bit of an edge case, but it was an interesting challenge to do it nevertheless. So then moving to JSON didn't change the implementation really. It's still an object on the layout, a custom function and a script. Although there are some more scripts involved if you want to trigger your history via an on layout load script, as opposed to using the custom function on the button. In fact, I've now switched, I believe it's in this one, I can't remember now. I believe this one, yeah, this one is now using the hide calculation, which we didn't have originally, in order to trigger it, and then just returning false so it doesn't hide anything. So where's my script? So I think I will show you some of the scripts because that is.
So Paul, what is causing the JSON to get updated?
Okay, so what happens is I've decided that I wanted to store the layout on layout entry, and I wanted to be able to add this to a solution irrespective of what the existing navigation is. Okay, so it is literally a case of you paste in the custom function, you paste in the script folder, and every layout you want to be included in the history and the browser navigation, you stick these buttons on. Obviously, you can format the buttons however you like, and that is it. That is all that's involved. It doesn't matter how your other navigation works, it will still store everything in this single global variable, and it just works. So it's really, really easy to implement and to add to a solution that's been around for ages. So, and you can use the script control to toggle it on and off. So you can tell it if you're having to do a long process that's going through a number of layouts that would normally be stored in the history, and you don't want them stored, then you can just turn it off. Or if you go to a developer layout that doesn't have the buttons on, then they won't be included in the history because the trigger's not triggered. It's triggered by a calculation inside the custom function, which we put in the hide calculation for this object. So, and then the backwards and forwards just take the one word parameter backwards or forwards, and they read the JSON and decide where they need to go. So
very interesting.
There isn't really a great deal to it. I realized as I was starting to talk about it or to write about it that there isn't a huge amount to it, but it has proved to be quite popular. I don't know does anyone know when the modular FileMaker site went offline? Because I only noticed when I was preparing that it doesn't seem to be there anymore.
It was last week, sometimes last week.
Was it literally last week? So I
repeat the question.
This module and the example file were on the modularfilemaker.org.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, and that's where most of the inquiries about it came from, and most of the ideas for the additional functions and capabilities were from there, and it's been consistently downloaded periodically, and it's just, I don't know, it is one of the things that I have to admit that it's one of the things I'm quite pleased to have built, because it was so simple in its end result and so easy to add to existing solutions. So in the most recent version, then there are some initial settings you can put in, which are basically this populates the variable if there's doesn't exist. Will all windows share a common history? If this is false, then each window will have its own history. If you're having a common history, do we want to hide the active window when you switch to another window so that there's only one window visible at a time? So that's just a toggle you can turn off. And then more recently, I've added the ability to save the slide and tab panels with the layout in the history. So that was quite interesting, because I got stuck to start with, because I'm storing my layout on layout entry, so that but if you're storing the tab state, you want to store that on layout exit, because you want to go back to the last one that you've been to. So that actually requires an on layout exit to store the tab elements into the JSON object. And then you also then need an on entry script trigger to go through and restore the tab panels to the front. So I was in two minds as to whether to put this in at all, because it felt like it kind of added a layer of complexity that was perhaps more than the benefit it offered, but it's optional. So I guess I felt in the end that I felt it was okay. And then the other thing that was quite important that I was reminded of was that if somebody closes a window, then we need to loop through all the windows that are represented in the JSON object and delete their history, so that we're tidying up after ourselves.
One thing I'm really noticing is that you have a unique way of invoking the calculation engine that I haven't seen used before, of putting it in the hide calculation for an object. And of course, that's always evaluated when you go to a layout. So that's a really unique way of invoking the calc engine.
Yeah, well, originally it was in the conditional formatting because we didn't have hide.
Right.
And then when hide came along, it just seemed hide seemed to be the better option, really. So,
Right.
but yeah, that was because I wanted it to be really easy. If you've got to add it to 100 layouts, then going in and editing or creating an on layout entry trigger script for every layout is a bit of a pain.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just, and you've got to put the buttons on the layout anyway. So it just seemed like a sensible approach to have everything that you needed included in the buttons that you paste onto the layout.
It's a very, very useful technique. So thank you.
Yeah, it's really tidy is the way I see it. I have to put my hand up and say that the adding of the tab and slide panel stuff is based on, you know, I'm not inventing anything new here. It's something that's been done before, and I've just picked up a custom function and modified it that was done by, who was it done by now? I can't quite remember. Daniel Shockley built this custom function based on some work by Todd Geist. So I have to stand on the shoulders of giants, as most of us do, I think, when we're evolving techniques.
Are you ready for questions?
Sorry?
Are you ready for questions?
Absolutely, yeah. I'm sorry, it's not as long a presentation because there's not actually that much to it.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, absolutely.
Right. So one of my concerns with back forward type of navigation in the FileMaker system has always been that I've been worried that it would create a false sense of security for users. The notion being moving back or forward a layout doesn't necessarily put you in the same place you were, because it doesn't address what records or record sets you were looking at and what you were doing there. Is that not an issue in practice? Have you addressed this in any way?
Well, I have had a few requests for that, and I have to say I've resisted it because I think it's really difficult to do. You know, you can do it. You'd have to use something like, you know, snapshots, which I think you can do if you want to be able to restore found sets, sort order, which record you're actually on in that found set. I just decided that initially that I just wanted to be able to go back through the layouts, and that gave me enough of a benefit. It gave me kind of most of the benefit that people were looking for. And I've never actually been asked to add the ability to restore found sets and things. Mostly people use it for just being able to quickly navigate back to where they were.
Interesting. So like I said, my concern was always that it would look like a boon to the users, and then it would create more of a problem because it wouldn't do everything they thought back would do. But it sounds like that concern is unsubstantiated.
Well, I can only speak from my own experience, you know.
Which is fathoms more than mine, which is 0. So,
so you know, that hasn't been a question that's come up very often. I think in some ways what it enabled me to do was to not to have explicit navigation to the place you've come from, if you see what I mean, on every layout. So you can the back button will take you back through the places you were previously without you having to go back to or have a space on your layout to show all the particular places you could go to next. So my development style has tended to be one where I do make quite a lot of use of you know, the little arrow buttons in portals for drilling through to a related information, and I think that in combination with going back has worked quite well. So, you know, if you're on an invoice and you click one of the line items, it will take you to the list of line items with the one you've clicked, and then you just use the back arrow to go back to the invoice, and that seems to have worked quite well for my customers anyway.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you for that insight.
Paul, there's a question about the tooltip on the buttons.
Yes.
And what can you hover over and just show us what's displayed there?
Oh, hang on.
Okay, so it's showing you the name of the layout that you will be going
Yeah.
to.
So if I go forward as far as I can, then if I'm lucky, where's it gone? The layout 1. Oh, that's interesting. I thought it said nowhere to go or something when there was nowhere to go. But maybe I broke it. Yeah, I mean, the tooltips. Personally, I usually kind of know where I've just been. And so I don't usually find myself hovering long enough to see the tooltips, because I know I want to go back to that customer that I'm looking at the invoices for or whatever. But it seemed like a good thing to have at the time.
Right. And following up on Steve's comment, if you're going back, if you're on a layout, with a found set, you go to a different layout. If you just go back to that first layout, it's still going to retain your found set.
Oh, absolutely.
It'd be more that if you then went to a different layout and then back to that, that layout again. Obviously, if you're going back in your history, the layout's not going to contain multiple found sets. So
no, absolutely. So if you go
one hop back, it will retain the found set, and I
Yeah.
assume the current record.
Yeah, it'd be whatever's on your layout, whether it's a list view or whatever. It'll be just like going to back to a layout through any other methodology. Really, it's not doing anything.
Right. But you have built-in functionality you can take advantage of. That you get for free, going back to a layout the first time. But
yeah, it remembers where you were.
If you kept on going back through your history and you came to that same layout again, obviously it would still have the latest found set.
Absolutely.
Not the original found. Or
Yeah,
the found
absolutely.
set.
Absolutely. I mean, my experience has been that generally you're usually only going back 1, 2, or 3, layouts in the history before you're kind of then going off down a different tree, if you see what I mean.
Right.
That the chances of going back 10 layouts, I think, is quite small. I don't know about you, but how often do you go in a browser? Do you end up going back, 10 pages? It's normally only 1 or 2, isn't it? A few before you then go off in a different direction forwards.
Right. I see Tony has just posted a link to a YouTube video in the chat about storing the found set, the current record, and sort order in an FMP URL.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, let me add a disclaimer to that. I did a presentation for the group that meets in England, Brighton, and it wasn't my best presentation. I had some technical things, so I feel a little bit sad. That said, I did, the content, if you pay attention, is pretty good. You can actually store a found set, the layout, and I'm using layout ID, found set, current record, and I forget pretty much everything, including the sort order. It takes a little bit of a setup. It can be done.
Okay.
And, so that addresses what was talked about earlier. And one other thing, I wanted to ask you about layout ID. I posted something. There's a little bit of a gotcha that I've seen bite people about getting the layout ID. The function that gets the layout ID has a scope that can target external file. So I've seen on community, someone said, hey, it was wrong. Is the 2 files, same name, can be a little bit of a gotcha. So I dropped a link to a custom function that specifically targets the current file. But that all said, I really like your implementation, and I look forward, if it's available, to downloading, having a look.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Real clean. Real clean.
Absolutely available. If I go, is it here? Yeah, I can post that in the chat, can't I? So, but yeah, it's available. Obviously, it's not available through Modular FileMaker at the moment.
There's like a call to action. Let's rebuild the modular. Yeah, a lot of good stuff.
Well, it's interesting. In some ways, it feels like Modular FileMaker has been superseded by the sort of add-on that we have, capabilities that we have now, and that perhaps that it needs to be reborn as a sort of add-on community, perhaps. I don't know.
what's interesting is the JSON.org link. If you look under FileMaker, it points you back to that modular.org. And it's so sad that we can't change that.
And so who maintains modular FileMaker? Is that, or who had been maintaining it? Do we know?
I thought it was Todd.
Yeah, I think it was Todd. Yeah.
Todd mentioned that the site was hacked and it's likely it's going to be restored anytime.
Ah, okay.
It was a WordPress site.
That explains it, doesn't it? So, yeah. Oh, you know, you can still find it in the Wayback Machine, can't you? So, if you want to go and look at stuff. So, is it gone? I'll stick the URL in the chat.
I actually just did. So, but
okay.
John just commented, it looks like it might be the older version on that.
Yeah,
link.
the very latest version with the tab panel stuff's not up there yet. I didn't have the opportunity to test it as thorough as I wanted, and it got forgotten about during the COVID. So I do need to get it up there. I will get it. I will put it up there in the next few days. But I only realized when I was preparing that it wasn't there yet, and I ran out of time to get it up there before the meeting. So, any other questions?
Hi, Paul. Just a little question, which is it's a fairly obvious question, but just worth seeing. So as I'm understanding, because I use on layout enter triggers for stuff, but obviously this will work fine with that, right? Because this is just going to do a go to layout, and then because I actually have like tab panels saving and stuff, I've already implemented that, but I really like it. Thank you. And I know my users, they've sometimes asked me, can't we just have a back button like in a browser?
Well, what's interesting is that I've had people down who email me and say that they've used it, but they've only used the back button because they didn't want people to go forwards again, which I thought was interesting. And I guess you have that flexibility, to do that if you want to. And yeah, so yeah, if you want to do it through the script trigger rather than the hide calculation, then basically that's it, single line.
Yeah, no, but I don't. That's what I like about it, because I've already got script triggers. So I just want to paste in that and then have it work without me having to change anything. That's
absolutely. You have the choice. Obviously
smart.
you do need, if you want to do the panel stuff, then you do need the triggers. But if you don't want to use the panel stuff, just stick the buttons on the layout and it will work.
Yeah, well, it was actually the other way around, is because I really like the navigation, but I've got a solution where I've already got a nice solution that works very well with the tab panels.
Okay, cool.
So there's no need for me to change that, but then I don't have a nice back button, forward button. So so that's what I really like about that, using the high condition. I think that's brilliant. So I can just paste it in and it won't mess with, I won't have to redo it.
Doesn't mess with anything. No, absolutely.
Right.
It's one of the things I like most about it, is that you just go down your layouts and do paste, move it to the top left, paste, move it to the top left. It's just really, really easy, and it's relative and pretty safe, really. It's not gonna.
Yeah, it's go to layout, right? I mean, in the basic information. So what can go wrong?
Yeah. So I have to say, when I was preparing this, I noticed how moving from just a list of a tab separated list of items for the history to JSON, obviously the data that's stored in the variables there's a lot more data, and in fact the script has got more complicated because it's having to use the JSON functions, but the user, as far as from a user perspective, you don't really see that because it's still just the script, the custom function, and the buttons. The advantage from my perspective of using the JSON is that there's only one variable added to my data viewer, and I have to admit to having a bit of a pet hate of solutions that fill my data viewer with global variables, because then when I'm debugging a script, I can't see the ones I'm interested in. There's too much noise. So I was quite keen to just have it as a single variable with everything stored in there, regardless of how many windows it's operating on.
I suppose theoretically also, you just purely theoretically, you have a sort of history for a UX designer to examine and work out, how you can optimize your UX.
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely. You could store that in a sort of a session log if you wanted to. And that, I mean, that was why I switched to layout IDs from layout numbers, because that would be reliable even if you went back, you know, a month later, as it were, and the developer's done some work on it. It should still work. So, yeah, that was the reason. It's really frustrating, isn't it, that we don't have a native get layout ID function and we have to hack it, really.
Yeah, I've used that for a long time, get layout ID. I think the FileMaker Bible, the FileMaker 10 Bible, I got it from there.
Yeah, it's interesting. And likewise, it would be really great if we had window IDs, wouldn't it? Because that is one potential problem with the solution, is that it uses the window name. And if your scripts, you know, can produce two windows with the same name by taking the 2 off it or whatever it might be, then potentially your navigation could get mixed up between the 2 windows.
Yeah,
if you wanted to have independent window histories. But you know, that's something the developer has to take into account, because we don't have a window ID that we can access, do we? So
no, I do. I might have to do multiple windows, but I've just implemented window naming. Every window gets named by when it gets opened on the script. So so I keep control of it, kind of. Yeah, because there isn't a native way.
Yeah. So I did I did do another little technique, which was about invisible window IDs, which used it used a binary number to identify the window, and then used 2 different invisible characters as the 2 to create the binary number, so that you wouldn't see them in the display. But that way you could identify a window by a number.
You can, if I'm not mistaken, also put a carriage return in a Windows name, and it will only display the first line. Yeah, but
I believe there was I seem to remember there was an issue with the cross-platformness of that. I can't quite remember though.
I'm not sure. I haven't used it in a long time. It was a long time ago.
Yeah. But it just seems to be a bit. I'm sure there must be a window ID somewhere, but it's just a shame we can't access.
Yeah, we ought to have it.
So any more questions?
I guess to your point that people are not using this to go back, 10 steps. I assume you could add so that it just truncated after, keep just the most recent 5, something.
Yeah,
like
I'm sure that would be possible. Actually, that might be a nice little thing to do when I'm bored, isn't it? Is to have another parameter which is
how many steps?
History limit. Yeah.
Because you can imagine, with someone, if they're using it for the system for hours and hours, that list is going to get very long, which I'm sure will make it, maybe not noticeable, but certainly slower to parse.
Yeah, that's true.
To and all of that. So, I mean, it's global variable, but you still have to parse it.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So it might make sense to have a limit in terms of how many steps back you're saving.
Yep. I'm going to do that. That sounds like a nice little enhancement. Yeah.
I've made work for you.
You have, but it's one of these. It's like a little pet project, really. I like, every time somebody asks me for something, I have to try and find a way to do that doesn't increase the burden of maintenance or installation for people, because the top priority was ease of implementation.
Right. I don't know if you were at the last month or the month before's meeting, but there was a demonstration of JSON query, and that shows just how far a pet project can go when allowed.
Yeah, I watched that when it was posted somewhere, and I was in awe. That is just an awesome custom function, isn't it?
Right. So pet projects can take over your life, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but this one's just kind of every now and then somebody asks, "Can it do this?" And if I think I can make it work, then I do. So I will definitely have a look at that technique for restoring found sets and such like, and see whether that could be incorporated whilst meeting my ease of implementation criteria.
Sounds good. Any other questions before we wrap up? Doesn't sound like it. So Paul, thank you very much for taking the time to present to the group.
Thank you so much.